Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Jonathan, the Paprika Elf, and today we're going to be talking about a playwright from England that you may have heard about before, William Shakespeare. Now, if you are an English speaker, the chances are pretty good that you've had some exposure to Shakespeare already, either through formal study in high school or college, or you've seen a performance or a movie based off of one of his plays. In my high school, I got Shakespeare 3 times: Romeo and Juliet, The Tempest, and Hamlet. You might be thinking that I'm going to tell you how I instantly loved Shakespeare, but the truth is I was not a fan initially, and I didn't understand why there was such a fuss about Shakespeare. I have a hunch that some of you might feel the same way. My high school education did expose me to a variety of literature, but at that time I judged books purely on whether I was entertained. I loved The Count of Monte Cristo and Don Quixote because they were funny and exciting. I didn't love Shakespeare because it was hard work and I didn't understand why it was important. Reading poetry and drama is a bit more challenging than reading prose. In fact, I joke that I learned to love poetry and drama not because of how it was taught to me in high school, but in spite of it. My introduction to Shakespeare was rigid and formulistic. We started with Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade, and I'm guessing the administrators chose Romeo and Juliet because they thought the story would be familiar to students. It has, after all, entered popular culture, and it is a lot more widely known than any of Shakespeare's other stories. Still, I think it's a bad choice for the first exposure to Shakespeare. The tragedies have dark and serious overtones to them, and they require a maturity that most 9th graders lack. I remember the literature that I read in 8th grade, and it was not very challenging at all. We had just started to get into more controversial and adult themes. One year we were reading The Walkabout by James Vance Marshall and The Wave by Todd Strasler, and the very next year we were expected to read Romeo and Juliet. I don't even know that I'd ever read drama before 9th grade. Not only was the convention a bit unusual, but so were a lot of the words and expressions. When we study Shakespeare, there is no getting around the difficulties of the language. Shakespeare wrote 400 years ago, and the English language has changed a lot since then. But, in my opinion, the language of Shakespeare's comedies is more accessible to first-time readers than the tragedies or the histories. In general, they require less historical context, and they are full of references to love, sex, and mistaken identities that should be of interest to most teenagers. Take Shakespeare's most famous comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and you have young lovers running from their parents, a bit of magic, and plenty of situational humor that requires very little explanation. The 2006 movie She's the Man is loosely based on the play Twelfth Night, and while it is adapted for the high school setting, the sexual tension and gender confusion comes straight from the original text. I have introduced quite a few people to Shakespeare over the years, primarily through wine and poetry nights that my wife and I used to host at our house, and my experience has been that people can read Shakespeare more easily than they think they can. In an upcoming video, we will look at Shakespeare's language in more detail, but let's talk generally about some of the issues with reading the plays. We can start with words like thee, canst, and hath. These are not frequently seen today, but they are generally intelligible. Then you have words that aren't really used in modern English anymore, but depending on if your religious background included a lot of hymns, or if you have read a lot of 18th and 19th century literature, you might still know them. I'm talking phrases like nigh, near, or almost, prithee, I pray thee, or knave, tricky fellow. More difficult are the words that are still used today but have a different meaning now than they did during the time of Shakespeare's plays. Constant, true, silly, innocent are examples of those shifting definitions. These words and phrases may present difficulties to the reader, but most Shakespeare collections with notes will generally be sufficient, and they are readily available. My wife and I have 5 different Shakespeare collections. Bevington, Riverside, Oxford, the annotated Shakespeare, and the Kittredge Player's Illustrated Edition. Most of these we got from secondhand bookstores quite inexpensively. Armed with a good anthology, Shakespeare is quite readable for the beginner, and one should not be afraid to try. I think many people are intimidated by Shakespeare because he's one of the most famous writers of all time, and they worry they aren't smart enough to understand him. Fortunately for us, Shakespeare does not need to be limited to the people who have formal literature training. The Bard wrote his plays for both the educated and less educated people alike. The cheapest ticket to one of Shakespeare's plays at the outdoor theaters would have been only a penny. Assuming you could find a break from your work, this was a very reasonable entry price. Better seats had higher prices, of course, but the theater was not the province exclusively for the well-to-do. Some of the theaters could seat thousands of people, and they were popular enough to be of concern to the Puritans. In fact, the playhouses had to be built outside the official limits of the City of London, because they weren't exactly seen as reputable. Queen Elizabeth officially banned the theaters from being inside the city limits to appease the Puritans, but she was no Puritan herself. Several of Shakespeare's plays were performed at the royal court for the Queen and her attendants. We'll talk more about the Puritans in a later episode, but they wanted the entire country to be under their very strict moral standards. Religious fundamentalism is, after all, no new thing. Queen Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII, who had fueled the Reformation in England by moving the Church of England away from the Roman Catholic Church. Prior to Elizabeth taking the throne, her half-sister Mary had been Queen of England, and she, a Catholic, had tried to reverse what her father had done. Elizabeth became queen during a time of religious tension, as different groups petitioned how similar or dissimilar England's religion should be from continental Europe. In addition to the intrigues between pro- and anti-Catholic groups, there was also the rise of the Puritans, a very conservative religious group that grew in power and influence in English politics. Shakespeare grew up in this environment, and writing plays at a time when there was increased scrutiny from both the Puritans and the government censors could not have been an easy thing. I think it shows the genius of Shakespeare that he appealed to both the tradespeople and the aristocrats at a time when there was so much religious and political tension. The government was sensitive to any language that could be considered seditious, and the Puritans were angry with pretty much anything that might be considered fun. My Shakespeare professor in college suggested that the Bard may have intentionally tried to troll the Puritans, who would no doubt have been in the theaters to catalog how sinful they were. We will probably never know for sure if Shakespeare baited them on purpose, but it's fun to imagine him including lines that would have gotten the Puritans all fired up. One thing that is certain is that Shakespeare had a really good ear for tempo in the English language, and even though it was written in blank verse, it still reads quite naturally for the most part. I've watched B-side movies written in modern English that sounded much, much worse. If you polled people to find out what they like most about Shakespeare, I think most of them would say that it is the dialogue which fleshes out the characters he has written. Drama is always going to have a minimalism inherent in the genre, and this was especially true of the Elizabethan stage, as they did not generally use props. It was the characters' words which indicated what they were doing and gave a sense of location and relation to others. Writing drama is more challenging than writing prose because the sense of the character has to come from what the character says about themselves or what other people say about them, and we generally don't have the aid of narration. Let us consider a scene in Twelfth Night as an example of Shakespeare's characterization in this minimalist landscape. Imagine it is the early 1600s and you have bought a ticket to the play at one of the open theaters, where the center part of the roof is open to the sky, because there is no electric light at this time. It's hopefully not too cloudy, and you are watching the men dressed for their parts in the outlandishly colorful costumes. There's no furniture, no set backdrops, just the actors on a raised stage. It's the scene where Sir Toby plays a trick on Malvolio, the steward of Olivia. He is an obnoxious braggart, and he is obsessed with Olivia, Sir Toby's niece. Olivia is not attracted to Malvolio at all. Sir Toby has Olivia's servant, Maria, who would have been played by a beardless young man, drop a letter that appears to be written by Olivia to Malvolio. While Malvolio reads the letter in center stage, Sir Toby and his friends Sir Andrew and Fabian and Maria are all watching from the far corner of the stage where they are hiding. Please note, I've condensed the passages slightly. The letter. If this fall into thy hand, revolve. In my stars I am above thee, but be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, Some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Thy fates open their hands, let thy blood and spirit embrace them. And to inure thyself to what thou art like to be, cast thy humble slough and appear fresh. Be opposite with the kinsmen, surly with the servants. Let thy tongue tang arguments of state. Put thyself into the trick of singularity. She thus advises thee, that sighs for thee. Remember who commended thy yellow stockings, and wished to see thee ever cross-gartered. I say, remember. Go to, thou art made, if thou desirest to be so. If not, let me see thee a steward still, the fellow of servants, and not worthy to touch fortune's finger. Farewell, she that would alter services with thee. The fortunate unhappy. Malvolio then says that he will do all that the letter advises because he is convinced that Olivia is secretly in love with him, even though she is of a higher social status. After Malvolio exits, we can imagine him skipping with delight, Maria says, If you will see then the fruits of the sport, mark his first approach before my lady. He will come to her in yellow stockings, and 'tis a colour she abhors, and cross-gartered, a fashion she detests, and he will smile upon her, which will now be so unsuitable to her disposition, being addicted to a melancholy as she is, that it cannot but turn him into a notable contempt. If you will see it, follow me. Just a few scenes later, we have this interaction between Olivia and Malvolio. Where's Malvolio? He is sad and civil, and suits well for a servant with my fortunes. Where is Malvolio? Maria responds, He is coming, madam, but in a very strange manner. He is sure possessed, madam. Why, what's the matter? Does he rave? No, madam, he does nothing but smile. Your ladyship were best to have some guards about you if he come, for sure the man is tainted in his wits. Go, call him hither. I'm as mad as he, if sad and merry madness equal be. Malvolio enters the room. How now, Malvolio? Sweet lady, ho, ho! Smilest thou? I sent for thee upon a sad occasion. Sad, lady? I could be sad. This does make some obstruction in the blood, this cross-gartering. But what of that? If it please the eye of one, it is with me as the very true sonnet is, please one and please all. Why, how dost thou, man? What is the matter with thee? Not black in my mind, though yellow in my legs. It did come to his hands, and commands shall be executed. I think we know the sweet Roman hand. Wilt thou go to bed, Malvolio? To bed? Aye, sweetheart, and I'll come to thee. God comfort thee! Why dost thou smile so, and kiss thy hand so oft? Maria then says, How do you, Malvolio? At your request? Yes, nightingales answer daws. Why appear you with this ridiculous boldness before my lady? Be not afraid of greatness, 'twas well writ. Olivia responds, What meanest thou by that, Malvolio? Some are born great, huh? Some achieve greatness. What sayest thou? And some have greatness thrust upon them. Heaven restore thee! Remember who commended thy yellow stockings. Thy yellow stockings? And wish to see thee cross-gartered. Cross-gartered? Go to, thou art made, if thou desirest to be so. Am I made? If not, let me see thee a servant still. Why, this is very midsummer madness. We've all known people like Malvolio, and we all love to see those people taken down a peg or two. The Elizabethan age was no different, and many of the people there could probably identify a Malvolio in their own life, maybe even their own master. Because Shakespeare is drama and was meant to be performed, I recommend reading Shakespeare out loud if possible. Reading it out loud will force you to slow down and hear the rhythm of the language. It is even better if you can read it with a friend. At our poetry nights, I would assign out different characters to people, and we would read some of the funnier scenes from the comedies. Most of the people had little to no experience with reading Shakespeare, but reading out loud got everybody engaged with the text, and we did it without needing a significant technical introduction. I added a few comments here and there as needed, but that was it. And that brings us back to the problem of how Shakespeare is taught in high school. In 9th grade, we learned about the Globe Theater and iambic pentameter and the Elizabethan stage, and it made Shakespeare feel like a chore. We did some reading in class, but it was accompanied by all this information we needed to know about Shakespeare and this time, and it just made the experience unpleasant overall. Funny thing is that now that I can see the other side of the argument, now I love Shakespeare, and I do find all the details about England in the 16th century fascinating, and I understand why they are useful to learn. But I did not feel this way in high school. When we studied Romeo and Juliet, I was bored out of my mind by the technical details. I don't think that the point of ninth grade English should be to teach facts about Shakespeare as much as learning to love Shakespeare and the language itself. I know there's no certainty that any piece of literature will click with any particular student, but there are better ways and there are worse ways to present material to students for the first time. And giving them lots to study before reading the text is not a great introduction. Almost none of the facts that I learned in freshman English stuck with me, but I still remember some of the things we read. We remember the things that fired our imagination, much more than we remember the related information. Schools need to adopt a reading-first emphasis, where a wide range of material is taught with focus on presenting literature in a way that is interesting and engaging to high school students. Schools drastically overvalue memorization. We can still have advanced English courses where it's more appropriate to study contextual details, but I think we burden so many students unnecessarily with information that they don't really need to read the text. At my high school, we had to take 8 semesters of English as a minimum, and I ended up taking 10 semesters total. And out of all the classes, my most vivid memories are the texts that we read. Whether it was Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, first time I read an essay by Virginia Woolf, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, The Stranger by Albert Camus, and many others. I barely remember what my teachers taught in those classes, but the stuff that we read, a lot of that still sticks with me. When I advocate for less memorization of facts and more reading, let me be clear, I am not suggesting we should only assign works that are easy to read to high school students. By no means. In my high school, I read Zora Neale Hurston and Maya Angelou and Lorraine Hansberry, and those were challenging to read because the stories were so raw, and they shocked me in a way that I needed to be shocked. I had never heard stories about America like that before. And we covered many other challenging authors besides those mentioned, and they really made me reconsider a lot of the ideas that I had taken for granted. For that reason alone, I think we should put as many authors in front of students as we can. But if we are going to assign difficult works to high school students, then we should drop the busy work that often accompanies it. There's plenty of time for that in college or later in life. As a former student and now a parent with kids of my own in school, I worry that as school administrators continue to chase standardized test targets, they are teaching the new generation of readers that we read only so we can summarize and not for discovery. We must evaluate success in reading as comprehension of the themes and the ideas inside the books, and the documentation of how it affected us, and not as the regurgitation of just information. Going back to Shakespeare, you don't need to understand meter or stress or blank verse to read Romeo and Juliet. It might be interesting to learn afterwards, but it should not be a barrier of entry. At its heart, Romeo and Juliet is a story of doomed love, fleshed out with some drama between two powerful houses. It doesn't really matter how much you know about England or history, you can follow along with the story all the same. In college, I took a class on Shakespeare, and that is where I really became a believer in the Bard. That class was my first time reading the history plays. They're a bit harder to get into, and I definitely wouldn't recommend them for people trying Shakespeare for the first time. Yet they are fascinating character studies, especially Henry V and Richard III. There's a particularly chilling film adaptation of Richard III where Ian McKellen plays the main character, but he's portrayed as a fascist. In the movie, I don't think they ever use the term Nazi, but it is heavily implied. In this series, we'll get to the histories eventually, but we'll work up to them. The roadmap for Shakespeare will be to start with the comedies, go into the tragedies, then the romances, and finally the history plays. Since this is a channel on both literature and cinema, I plan to discuss as many film adaptations of each play as I can find. The first play we will cover is A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I've already lined up 3 films to review. But before we go into A Midsummer Night's Dream, I do want to do a formal introduction to Shakespeare and Elizabethan England. I'm sure some of you are thinking, wait, didn't you just tell us how useless all this information was in high school? Well, yes and no. I think this introductory material absolutely can be presented in an interesting and engaging manner, and that it can be useful to first-time readers of Shakespeare. However, the way it was presented at my high school was in a quite pedantic way, and it was not useful at all. At its heart, this series on Shakespeare is how I wish the material had been presented to me for the first time. It is my intention to show that the historical context can be quite interesting and useful for deepening our understanding of Shakespeare's plays, but we have to break free from the high school English educational paradigm. I would never intend disrespect to high school English teachers because they have a hard job, and I do believe that most of them are very sincere in their efforts to help kids understand reading and writing. I credit many of my high school English teachers with setting me on this path that would eventually lead to a degree in English literature and helping me become a lifelong reader. When I criticize high school English, I'm specifically speaking against the top-down, prescriptive, one-size-fits-all educational curricula that comes from the administrators, politicians, and parents who have never taught in high school and have forgotten completely what it means to be a student. So many great high school teachers are constrained by school curricula that think education can be commodified into discrete units. Some of you may be wondering at this point why we should bother studying Shakespeare at all. We've had plenty of literature in the last 400 years. Why do we need to keep reading Shakespeare? Why put in the effort that you say is needed to understand him? These are fair questions, and there are no simple answers. Shakespeare has been a profound influence on both writers in English and the English language over the years. Many everyday expressions in English come from his plays. But, perhaps just as significantly, Shakespeare stands as a bookend at a time of great change between the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern. That change would have occurred without Shakespeare's presence, but at a time when so many writings were in Latin, Shakespeare's writings stand as a powerful vernacular tour de force, a monument of English literature. We take it for granted now that there are so many things to read, but Shakespeare wrote at a time when there were far fewer books, and publishing in the English language was just starting to catch on. My hope is that at the end of this tour, if you're still here with us, you'll have a better understanding of why Shakespeare remains so popular after so many years, and why it is so widely read and performed. In my own journey with Shakespeare, I went from disinterested to definitely recommending him to other people. But I'm not going to tell you that you must love him. I hope that you will, and I will do my best to show you why I think the bard is worthy of the admiration we give him. But we should be clear on this. Shakespeare is not perfect. We can appreciate what is done well while still pointing out the problematic aspects in his writing. I think the study of Shakespeare is quite worthwhile, despite a lot of insensitivities that we will encounter. For me, personally, I appreciate the liveliness of Shakespeare's style. As a writer, I wish that I could write as well as he did. Even with my computer and so many more tools at my disposal, I'm awestruck by what he gave the world all those centuries ago. What Shakespeare accomplished in his lifetime is incredible, and I could never hope to present a comprehensive video series on Shakespeare's legacy. But what you can expect is a well-researched overview of selected plays with highlights of the plots and major characters, and I'll also read through some of the more iconic lines and scenes. I hope that you find these overviews of the plays and reviews of the different adaptations interesting. I'm really excited to see directors apply their own vision to these plays. I hope this video has piqued your curiosity and that it will inspire you to check out Shakespeare again, especially if you had a less than satisfactory experience of it in school. Probably wasn't your teacher's fault, and there's a good chance that if you give it a fair shot, you will find it enjoyable. Stay tuned for the introductory video coming soon on Elizabethan England, along with a general primer on Shakespearean language that should be helpful to you when reading his plays. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.